Welcome to Gwangi-Ui Yuksa. Listen. Before you see anything, before any image forms in your mind, just listen. There is breathing, wet, laboured. The sound of air being dragged through lungs that are slowly losing the fight. And underneath that breathing, the faint scrape of metal against metal. November 25th, 1177. You are looking at a teenage boy. 16 years old. He is trying to close his fingers around a leather rein, and he cannot do it. His hands are wrapped in linen bandages. This morning those bandages were white. Now they are rust brown, soaked through with something that was once blood and is now something worse. Beneath those bandages, flesh is rotting. In places, bone is visible through the skin. Leprosy does not simply kill a man. It erases him piece by piece, while he is still alive and still watching it happen. The silver mask concealing his face is not decorative. It is necessary. What lies beneath would make hardened veterans look away and say nothing. 3 miles ahead, the horizon has ceased to exist. 26,000 warriors. Mounted cavalry stretching so far across the plain that the dust they raise resembles fog drifting in from a distant sea. Banners in green, black and gold snack in the wind like the wings of hunting birds. The Sultan Saladin commands them. He is 40 years old. He has never lost a battle. He is so confident in tomorrow's outcome that he has already dispatched messengers to Damascus, describing in detail the victory feast they should begin preparing. Behind the boy in the silver mask, 500 knights, that is the full count. 500 exhausted men on exhausted horses, wearing armor dented from a dozen previous campaigns, carrying lances with chipped points and swords that need sharpening. The arithmetic is not complicated. 52 enemies for every Christian soldier on that field. These are the kinds of numbers that do not invite discussion. You do not fight those numbers. You surrender, or you accept that you are going to die. Every advisor had told him to stay behind Jerusalem's walls. Every military manual ever written said that riding out was not strategy but suicide dressed in armor. Even his own body, its nervous system hollowed out by disease, its joints swollen, its skin splitting open along the seams, was screaming at him to stop. Baldwin IV raised his bandaged hand and gave the order to charge. What followed in the next 3 hours broke the minds of everyone who tried to explain it afterward. Christian chroniclers called it divine intervention. Muslim historians called it a catastrophe sent by God as punishment for some unknown failing. Modern military analysts have spent centuries examining every detail and still struggle to reconcile the mathematics with the outcome. But here is the truth that every account of the Battle of Montgisard quietly avoids. The battle was already lost before a single lance came down. Saladin had made no mistakes. His army was rested and well supplied, positioned on terrain perfectly suited to cavalry. His commanders were experienced. His warriors were elite Mamluks, slave soldiers trained from childhood to do one thing with absolute precision. The crusaders were outnumbered 52-1. There was no version of this engagement in which the numbers made sense. So how did 20,000 of the finest warriors in the Islamic world end up dead in a single afternoon? The answer is not what you expect. And it begins with a decision Saladin made 3 days earlier. A decision so logical, so obviously correct, so completely reasonable, that it would destroy everything he had spent 15 years building. Jerusalem in 1177 is not the golden city of scripture and illuminated manuscripts. It is a corpse still learning how to pretend it is breathing. Walls cracked from 80 years of siege and neglect. Streets half empty because anyone with resources and sense had already fled months ago. The holiest city in Christendom, defended by fewer soldiers than some towns used to police a market fair. The kingdom exists on scar tissue and the stubborn refusal to acknowledge the obvious, and on the throne sits a 16-year-old boy whose own body is in open revolt against him. Baldwin IV was not supposed to be king. He was not supposed to still be alive. Leprosy in the 12th century is not simply a disease. It is a verdict. A declaration made visible on the skin. Lepers ring bells to warn people they are approaching. They are buried in unmarked graves, erased from family histories, treated as though they ceased to exist the moment the first white patch appeared on their skin. But Baldwin's father, King Amalric, recognized something in his son that the disease had not yet reached, a quality of mind that cut through problems with unusual clarity, an intelligence that sharpened under pressure rather than dulling. When Amalric died suddenly in 1174, the crown passed to a 13-year-old boy who would never marry, never produce an heir, whose kingdom was already being quietly measured for a coffin. Facing this dying kingdom, across the field of everything Baldwin had left to defend, stood Saladin. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub, He had risen from military commander to sultan through a combination of tactical brilliance and political skill that strategists would study for generations. By 1177, he had accomplished what entire dynasties before him had failed to achieve. He had united Egypt and Syria under a single purpose. And that purpose had one name: Jerusalem. He was 40 years old, at the height of his power, commanding nearly unlimited gold from Egyptian trade routes. Warriors sworn to him from a dozen different territories. Siege equipment capable of cracking the walls of any fortress in the region. Saladin was not a monster. That matters, and it is often misunderstood. He was pious, principled, and respected even by his enemies. He followed the established rules of war. He honored truces. He was known for mercy and victory. But none of that mercy changes what he was about to do to a dying kingdom with half-empty walls and 500 knights to its name. By the autumn of 1177, Europe had quietly stopped sending help. The Pope was privately negotiating what would happen after Jerusalem fell. The crusader states were no longer a priority on any map that mattered. If you are not yet feeling the weight of this moment, let it settle for a second. Everything that followed, the next 8 years of history, the survival of the crusader kingdom, the countless lives that hung in the balance, came down to a 16-year-old boy with rotting hands and a silver mask sitting in a throne room in a city no one believed could survive the week. The chroniclers who wrote about Baldwin almost always mentioned one detail in passing, as though they found it embarrassing, or perhaps simply did not know what to do with it. He smiled before battles. Not the forced confidence of a leader performing courage for the benefit of his men. Something more unsettling than that. Genuine anticipation. A leper king whose nervous system was so thoroughly destroyed by disease that pain had largely ceased to register. A young man who had nothing left to lose, smiling behind his silver mask as armies 20 times his size assembled on the horizon. Consider what that actually means. Pain is the body's warning system. It tells you when you have pushed too far, when something is broken, when stopping is no longer optional. Without it, there is no signal, no internal voice telling you that this is the moment to pull back. Baldwin had no warning system left. He could drive past every threshold that would collapse an ordinary man, and he would not know something had broken until it was already beyond repair. Saladin, for all his strategic genius, had never encountered this. He was about to. November 23rd, 1177. Saladin's army crosses into crusader territory. 26,000 mounted warriors, moving with the unhurried confidence of a force that already knows the outcome. The supply train alone stretches for miles. Tents, food, portable forges, siege equipment, gold enough to fund a campaign of any length. A Muslim chronicler who witnessed the march wrote that the banners of the faithful covered the hills like stars pulled down to earth, and that the sound of the hooves was like thunder that forgot how to stop. Saladin's plan is the kind of clean, methodical strategy that wins wars. Bypass the fortress of Ascalon. It is garrisoned and fortified, and a siege would cost time he does not need to spend. Sweep north along the coast instead, cutting Jerusalem off from the sea. Strangle the supply lines. Wait for starvation and internal collapse to finish what swords would otherwise take months to accomplish. He had executed this same approach before. It had always worked. Inside Jerusalem, Baldwin's advisors lay out the numbers in the throne room without softening any of it. City garrison, perhaps 750 men, mostly infantry. Available knights, 500 at an optimistic count. Templar reinforcements, 80 warrior monks already exhausted from weeks defending border castles. Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most experienced military commanders in the kingdom, delivered the assessment that everyone in that room already understood. Sire, we should negotiate terms while we still have something worth bargaining with. If we ride out, we die. If we die, the kingdom dies alongside us. The room went quiet. Baldwin sat in his throne. Standing for more than a few minutes caused his joints to swell and crack audibly. His advisors could see him trembling with the effort of remaining upright. But they could also see what he was working through in his mind. If he stayed behind Jerusalem's walls, the city might hold for weeks, possibly months if they rationed with discipline. But Saladin's army, moving freely through the countryside without opposition, would burn every village, every farm, every church within 50 miles. The civilian population would suffer slowly, with nowhere to run and no relief coming. If he rode out with 500 knights, they would almost certainly die quickly. But Saladin's army, occupied with killing knights in open battle, would not have the time or the momentum to devastate the surrounding countryside. The peasants might survive long enough for something to shift. It was not a choice between victory and defeat. It was a choice between dying with a purpose and dying slowly while watching everyone around you suffer first. Baldwin lifted his head. The silver mask caught the torchlight. Raymond, how fast can Saladin's army move when it is spread out and foraging? The question confused everyone in the room. Raymond frowned, trying to understand what was being asked. Slower than usual, he said carefully. They would need time to reform their ranks. But before he could finish the thought, Baldwin continued, and if we hit them while they are scattered? The room went cold. My lord, Raymond said, with respect. He gestured toward Baldwin's bandaged hands, his wasted frame. You can barely mount a horse without assistance. My hands can hold the reins. That is all I need them to do. What happened next was recorded by multiple independent sources, Christian and Muslim alike. Because what happened next was so far outside the expected range of human behavior that no one wanted to be the only person claiming it was true. November 24th, 1177. Baldwin IV is carried on a litter to the royal armoury because his legs can no longer manage the palace stairs without help. Knights strap his armour on carefully. His hands are too damaged to grip properly, so they tie his sword to his wrist with leather cords. He orders every available soldier to prepare for immediate march. 500 knights, 80 Templars, 3,000 infantry, moving north toward Saladin's army, toward the largest military force assembled in the region in living memory. Odo of Saint-Amand, the Templar Grandmaster, a veteran who had survived more battles than most men lived years, wept openly when he saw Baldwin lifted onto his warhorse. The king's body had to be strapped to the saddle. His legs no longer had the strength to grip. They marched at night, 45 miles in 36 hours. Healthy cavalry in good weather would find that pace punishing, for men carrying a king who needed to be tied to his horse. Marching toward a battle they did not expect to survive. It borders on something for which there is no good word. But here is the detail that changes the story. As they marched, Baldwin kept asking his scouts the same question, over and over. Is Saladin still moving north? Yes, sire. Is his army still spread out? Yes, sire. And each time Baldwin, exhausted, feverish, held upright in his saddle by nothing except stubbornness and leather straps, smiled beneath the mask. His knights assumed it was delirium. Fever breaking through the discipline of the mind. The first symptoms of a man who had finally asked too much of himself. They were wrong. Baldwin had recognized something in the pattern of Saladin's movements that no one else in that army had seen. He was betting everything on Saladin being brilliant, on Saladin making the logical choice. The correct choice. The choice that would undo him completely. November 25th, 1177. Dawn breaks over terrain that will be soaked in blood before sunset. Saladin received his first warning just after sunrise. A scout arrived on a horse that was foaming at the mouth, barely able to stand. My lord, crusader banners, on the north ridge. Saladin did not look up from his breakfast. A patrol, he said. They will withdraw when they see our numbers. My lord, the scout's voice faltered. There are hundreds of them, possibly thousands. Saladin looked up, and for the first time in his military career, the undefeated Sultan of Egypt and Syria understood that he had made a mistake. His army, moving with the easy confidence of a force that has never been seriously challenged, spread across 3 miles of countryside, units scattered across farms and valleys and hillsides, was caught completely out of formation, and worse, standing on that ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun, was a figure in full armor topped with a silver mask that caught the morning light like a second dawn. One of Saladin's commanders whispered, almost to himself, "Is that the Leper King?" Saladin stared at the ridge for a long moment. Then quietly, "God help us," he came. What Saladin did not understand yet, what no one except Baldwin had fully grasped, was that this battle would not be decided by numbers, or by the quality of the steel, or even by superior tactics. It would be decided by pain, or rather by the complete and irreversible inability to feel it. 2 in the afternoon. November 25th, 1177. The air smells like horse sweat and something sharper underneath it. Baldwin's 500 knights have formed a wedge. The 80 Templars are at the tip, men in white surcoats marked with blood-red crosses, men who have sworn oaths that include no provision for retreat, no provision for surrender, no provision for asking mercy. Behind them, secular knights who said their goodbyes yesterday and meant them. Men who know the arithmetic as well as anyone. And at the absolute front of this formation, strapped to his horse like a man being transported to his own burial, is Baldwin IV. His advisors make one final attempt. "Sire, we can still fall back. Regroup at the walls." Baldwin raised his right hand. The gesture should not have been possible. His fingers barely functioned. The muscles and tendons that should have controlled that movement had been degrading for years. But somehow, impossibly, he raised that hand high enough for 500 men to see it clearly. And he dropped it forward. The signal to charge. Imagine you are one of those knights. You are about to charge 26,000 warriors. The mathematics of your death are not in question. They have been calculated, discussed, and accepted. You are led by a 16-year-old boy whose body is actively decomposing around him, who needed to be tied to his horse to stay upright, who has no business being on a battlefield and knows it and does not care. And then, as the charge begins, as 500 horses surge forward and the ground starts shaking beneath you, you see him lean forward in the saddle. You cannot see his face, but you know he is smiling. And you think, if he is not afraid to die, then what exactly am I afraid of? At 400 yards, Saladin's scattered forces began scrambling to form defensive lines. Too late and too slow. At 300 yards, Muslim archers loosed their arrows. Black rain falling across the charging formation. Knights dropped. Horses screamed and tumbled. The charge did not slow. At 200 yards, Saladin himself was shouting orders, trying to rally his center. His elite Mamluks, 8,000 slave soldiers, were forming ranks as quickly as discipline and training allowed. But something was happening that the training had not accounted for. They were not afraid of the numbers charging toward them. They were afraid of the madness of it. The absolute, irrational, impossible refusal to stop coming. At 100 yards, Baldwin drew his sword. His hands did not work. The blade was tied to his wrist with leather cord. He should not have been able to raise it. But he lifted that sword above his head, and 500 knights behind him saw their dying king holding steel against the sky. And they screamed. Not a coordinated battle cry, something older and less controlled than that, something that sounded like fury and grief and faith burning together into a single sound. At 50 yards, Muslim horses began backing up. Animals understand things that soldiers sometimes refuse to accept. They smelled what was coming. At 10 yards, the front ranks of Muslim soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. 2:15 in the afternoon. The Templar wedge hit Saladin's center. The sound was not what you would expect from accounts of medieval warfare. It was not clean. It was wet and dense, and full of screaming that blended horses and men until you could not tell the two apart. In the first 30 seconds, 300 Mamluks ceased to exist, trampled under war horses bred specifically to be weapons, speared through by lances moving at full gallop, crushed under the weight of armored men doing 20 miles per hour. It was not combat in any organized sense. It was annihilation, and the charge did not stop. Cavalry charges are supposed to hit, wheel away, regroup, and assess. That is what every manual written before or since instructs. The Templars kept going. They drove through the Muslim center like something that had not been given the information that it should stop, and behind them, Baldwin's secular knights poured into the gap they had torn open, widening it, turning it from a breach into a wound that could not close. 2:30. Saladin's center broke, not an orderly retreat to secondary positions, not a tactical withdrawal. The center of the greatest Muslim army assembled in a generation simply stopped functioning as a military force. Men tore off armor because it was too heavy to run in. They trampled each other in the panic to get away from those white and red crosses that kept coming and refused to stop. Warriors who had never lost a battle ran from a charge, led by a boy who should have been in a monastery. Saladin was screaming at his officers to reform the line. No one was listening, because something impossible was happening. That dying boy on the dying horse was cutting through their formation as though he could see the outcome of every individual decision before it was made. And his knights were following him as though he had personally shown them the road to wherever they were going. And everywhere the silver mask turned, men fled. And here is where Baldwin's smile, the one his advisors had mistaken for delirium, finally makes sense. The ravines cutting through that plain, the natural channels and narrow valleys in the terrain that Saladin had not bothered scouting in detail because he had not expected to need a retreat route, were now funneling thousands of fleeing warriors into natural traps with no exit. Crusader knights pursued, and suddenly entire units of some of the finest soldiers in the world were trapped in narrow canyons with steep walls, pressed together, suffocating under the weight of their own momentum. A Christian chronicler wrote afterward that the ravines filled with bodies the way wells fill with water. A Muslim historian confirmed it from the other side. "We fled into the earth's mouth," he wrote, "and the earth devoured us." 3 in the afternoon. Saladin's personal guard, 2,000 of the finest warriors in the world, men bound by sacred oath to die before abandoning their sultan, saw the Templars still coming, and they ran. Saladin, abandoned, surrounded by collapse, did the only thing remaining to him. He found a racing camel, faster than a horse in this terrain, and he fled. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who had never lost a battle, who had commanded 26,000 soldiers that morning, was running for his life on a pack animal. By 4 in the afternoon it was finished. 20,000 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying across 3 miles of blood-soaked ground. Another 6,000 had scattered into the desert, abandoning weapons, armor, anything that might cost them a second of speed. Of Baldwin's 3,500 men, 1,000 were dead, devastating losses in any other context. In this one they had won. They had done the impossible. When they finally pulled Baldwin from his horse, he was unconscious. The straps were the only reason he had not fallen from the saddle during the charge. His bandages were soaked through. Wounds that had been barely manageable before had torn open under the physical stress of wielding a sword his hands should never have been able to hold. The knights around him thought he was dead. Odo of Saint-Amand checked for a breath, found one barely, and openly wept as he said to the men gathered around him, "He cannot feel pain. That is how he did it. He cannot feel his body breaking." So he never stopped. He never knew when to stop. You have just watched 500 men defeat 26,000. Not because they were stronger, not because they had better equipment, not because God reached down and adjusted the mathematics in their favor, because they followed a boy who had already lost everything except his will to keep going. And because that boy, by the specific cruel mercy of his disease, had no internal warning system left to tell him he had gone too far. What Saladin had calculated was a military problem. What Baldwin had brought to that field was something calculation cannot measure. The night after Montgisard, Jerusalem filled every window with candles. Church bells rang for 72 hours without stopping. Priests called it a miracle. Peasants who had been preparing to flee were dancing in the streets. Baldwin was being compared to the Maccabees, the ancient warriors who had defended the Jewish people against impossible odds. In the royal chamber, physicians argued about whether to amputate. The battle had accelerated Baldwin's leprosy in ways that could not be undone. Tissue that had been merely damaged was now necrotic. Infection was spreading through flesh that lacked the capacity to heal properly. His hands, which had somehow gripped a sword for 3 hours, were swollen to twice their normal size. He was 16 years old, and his body was now dying faster because of what he had chosen to do with it. The material gains were staggering. Saladin had abandoned his entire supply train. Tents, weapons, gold, food for 26,000 men, all of it became crusader property in a single afternoon. The war chest Saladin had brought to fund the siege of Jerusalem now funded the crusader kingdom for 2 years. Fortresses that had been preparing surrender terms began reinforcing their walls instead. European kingdoms that had privately written off Jerusalem started reconsidering. For the first time in decades, the crusader states were not simply surviving. They were, improbably, winning. In Cairo and Damascus, the damage went deeper than any battlefield loss. Saladin's reputation, constructed across 15 years of careful conquest and political maneuvering, had been built on one foundational promise: inevitable victory. One campaign, one battle, and Jerusalem would return. Now, governors in Egypt were quietly opening negotiations for separate arrangements. Syrian lords were openly questioning whether Saladin was truly God's chosen instrument, or simply a man who had been fortunate until the day he encountered someone who did not know how to be afraid. It took Saladin 10 years to rebuild what Baldwin destroyed in 3 hours. But here is what no celebration and no chronicle properly records. Baldwin's physicians told him he had perhaps 6 months to live. A year if everything went gently, which nothing in his life had ever done. The battle had accelerated his deterioration beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. He lived 8 more years, 8 years of increasing agony. He lost his sight, he lost his mobility, then his ability to hold a pen, then his ability to feed himself. But his mind remained sharp, precise, and clear until the very end. And during those 8 years, he defended Jerusalem against Saladin 3 more times. Never with more than 1,000 knights, never losing. In 1183, 6 years after Montgisard, Saladin and Baldwin met under a truce flag to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Baldwin arrived on a litter. He was blind by then, could not walk, could barely speak above a whisper. Saladin looked at this broken young man who had haunted him for the better part of a decade and said something that Muslim chroniclers preserved with evident care. I do not understand how God could place such a mind inside such a body. Baldwin's response, delivered through a translator because his voice no longer carried, was this: perhaps so that when I win, no one can claim it was by strength alone. Saladin rode away in silence. When Baldwin IV finally died in 1185, 24 years old, his body destroyed completely, his legacy secured in ways that no one had believed possible. Saladin waited exactly 2 years. Then he conquered Jerusalem. Without Baldwin, the crusader states collapsed within months. The kingdom that 500 men had saved at Montgisard fell apart in the end. Absence of the one person who had held it together, not by power or resources or numbers, but by the singular refusal to accept what the numbers said. His successors lost in years what Baldwin had defended for 8. The question that haunts Montgisard is the one military historians have never fully answered. Did he win, or did he simply delay the inevitable? Perhaps both are true, and perhaps that is the point. We live in an age built on calculation. Algorithms predict outcomes, models assign probabilities. Entire institutions have been constructed on the premise that more is better, that mathematics determines fate, that the right answer can always be arrived at if you have enough data and enough time to process it. And then you have November 25th, 1177, 500 against 26,000, and the 500 win, not through superior tactics, though Baldwin's were genuinely brilliant, not through terrain advantage, though he used it with precision, not through better equipment, because they had none. They won because one dying boy refused to accept that the calculation was final. Because that boy, by the specific nature of his disease, lacked the physical capacity to feel the moment when any reasonable person would have stopped. And because 500 men watching their king fight with a body that should have collapsed hours before it did, decided that if he was not done, neither were they. There is a letter that Baldwin wrote to his sister Sibylla in the months before his death. It is held in the Vatican archives, fragile and yellowed. In it he wrote, "I was told I would die young. They were right. I was told I would die a leper. They were right. I was told I could not rule. They were wrong. Perhaps God gives us our diseases so that we understand that flesh is temporary, but will is something else entirely. My hand stopped working years ago, but my kingdom still stands." By the time she received the letter, he was already dead. 2 years later, the kingdom fell. But for 8 years that should not have existed by any medical or military accounting, one young man with a rotting body in a silver mask held back an empire. This has been Gwangi-Ui Yoksa. The past is not finished with us. Stay with us, and we will keep going back into it together.